But no, thank you all for coming. It's nice to see various names that I recognise. So I'm just going to, but I'm afraid this will be brief in terms of my face. I'm going to put up a PowerPoint presentation before I start, and then we can go from there. So a few years ago now, I gave a lecture at UHI Executive Office in Inverness, and I'd been asked to speak about the centennial anniversary of the publication of a notable book, and this was The Scottish War of Independence by Evan MacLeod Barron, a prominent Invernessian and one-time editor of the Inverness Courier newspaper. Barron's work is still used today, although perhaps somewhat carefully, due to his broad narrative tone that often privileged detailed stories of daring do over objective analysis of the subject matter at hand. Still, Barron's work set out very deliberately to privilege the Highland participation in the conflict. And as he said himself in his introduction to the first edition, the Highlands have for so long been treated with such ignorance, neglect, and I regret to say contempt by Scottish historians that I have found it necessary to emphasise, in a manner which some may resent, the part played by the Highlands and the rest of Celtic Scotland in the War of Independence. I would simply ask such readers to remember that I am up against the accepted theories and beliefs of centuries, and that the true blame for any seemingly undue emphasis on things Highland and things Celtic in these pages lies at the door of those modern historians who have used the reputation which is theirs to perpetuate a view of Scottish history which is altogether fallacious and misleading. I would ask them to realise that the history of Scotland is not the history of the southern counties, which the Kingdom of the Scots added to itself by conquest and annexation, but the history of the whole land and people of Scotland. Quite powerful stuff. And I think this Barron achieved. His work, published first in 1914 and reprinted 20 years later, provided the Highland perspective on the war and emphasised the stories of men like Andrew Murray of Och, about whom my original lecture was also about. I would argue that Scottish historiography has come on significantly during the period of over a century between Barron's first edition coming out and today. Indeed, I use a great deal of such material myself. Still, there remain obvious gaps. While some families and regions have been subject to considerable study, and students are able to discuss the Campbells, MacDonalds, or indeed the Sinclair Earls of Orkney, others remain underrepresented in the historiography. The Randolph Earls of Murray, for example, were prominent leaders throughout the Wars of Independence, but are often absent from both academic and popular representations of the wars. And here on the slide, we have representations from two recent productions, Outlaw King, the film, and The Rise of the Clans BBC series, both of which representing Angus Og MacDonald, but very carefully eliding some of those other figures that they may have chosen to focus on. Similarly, the Earls of Ross and the Murrays of Och and Bothwell are equally absent. History is, of course, never fully written, and these gaps in historiography keep people like me in a job. But it remains that the north of Scotland is still somewhat disserved by accounts of the Wars of Independence. So today, I want to try and provide something of a counter to that, where I shall take as my focus the medieval earldom of Sutherland and its involvement in and contribution to the Scottish Wars of Independence. To start, though, I thought it would probably be useful just to provide a very basic bit of context. So the Scottish Wars of Independence sprang from an unforeseen and catastrophic turn of events that began in 1286 with the death of King Alexander III, the last male representative of the Canmore dynasty, which had ruled Scotland since 1058. Alexander III had been predeceased by all of his children. His sole remaining heir was a granddaughter, Margaret, daughter of Eric II of Norway. She nominally succeeded as Queen Margaret, but died before reaching Scottish soil on her route south. And this left Scotland in an unprecedented position of having no king and no obvious successor. Scotland was on the brink of civil war as nobles jockeyed for position, and in such circumstances the Scottish interim government turned to outside help, and indeed they turned to King Edward I of England. The English king oversaw a complex legal process called the Great Cause, which undertook to find who had the best claim to the throne of Scotland. Representatives of the families of Balliol and Bruce were held to have the best claims, and it was the Balliols who won the crown when King John was inaugurated in 1292. However, John's reign was problematised by the power wielded by Edward I as a consequence of his adjudication in the Great Cause, and the Scottish king was undermined at almost every turn by his powerful neighbour to the south. With war looking ever more likely, the Scots signed a treaty of mutual assistance with France in 1295, and launched a raid into England in 1296. Edward I's response was quick, large-scale, and effective. The Scots were defeated at Dunbar, and King John was forced to surrender. He was stripped of his royal status, and Scotland was stripped even of its title of kingdom. It was, in future, to be simply a land, part of the greater English hegemony. Scotland's apparent defeat was relatively short-lived, however, and there began the first in a series of phases of conflict from 1297 to 1304, when the Scots rebelled against Edward I's attempts to complete his conquest. This is the phase of Andrew Murray and William Wallace, of battles at Stirling Bridge, Falkirk, and Roslin. Over time, however, the Scots were worn down. A general surrender in 1304 looked to have ended the war, but fighting resumed once again in 1306 as a result of rebellion focused on the person of Robert Bruce. Grandson of the Bruce competitor during the Great Cause proceedings, Bruce sought to make himself king. Early defeat in 1306 was overturned by success from 1307 onwards. Scotland was riven by infighting, but Bruce spent much of his early campaigns focusing on defeating his Scottish enemies and those who continued to ally themselves with the English kings. Bruce's greatest victory at Bannockburn in 1314 was not the decisive moment that some would have us believe, and he spent the remaining 15 years of his life making his kingship a reality and building a coherent kingdom that supported his dynasty. Still, many Scots did not support him. To them, Bruce was a usurper, a murderer, and a man who had brought war and devastation to various parts of Scotland as he fought to defeat internal opposition. And such opposition did not disappear. And so, following Robert I's death in 1329 and the succession of his son, David II, as a 5-year-old child, that opposition was made manifest. An invasion of Scotland occurred in 1332. Led by Edward Balliol, son of King John, it included numerous men who had lost out when Bruce stripped lands from those who had fought against him. This group, known as the Disinherited, won a victory at Duplin Moor in 1332, and King Edward of Scotland was anointed at Scone. Rebellion by those loyal to David II began almost immediately, however, and the Disinherited sought English help to complete their victory. Thus began what has come to be known as the Second War of Independence. A war of attrition followed as disinherited English invasions occurred each summer, and Bruce forces swept the countryside after they had departed. This was a war less about land and more about the loyalty and support of the people. Throughout the 1330s, the Bruce Scots slowly turned back the disinherited advance, and as Edward III of England became less focused on Scotland, the forces of David II gained the upper hand. In 1341, the young king, who had spent the last 7 years in exile in France for his own safety, returned to his kingdom to lead the war effort personally. His large-scale invasion of England in 1346 ended, however, in defeat outside Durham at the Battle of Nevilles Cross. David and many of his nobles spent the next 11 years in English captivity, and this phase of conflict was only ended with the signing of the Treaty of Berwick in 1357, which resulted in the Scottish king's release. So this whistle-stop tour of history provides something of a context for what I'm going to focus on in the remainder of my talk, which is the extent to which these events impacted upon the Sutherland region and indeed the involvement of people from Sutherland in these national endeavours. As with much of medieval history, those we know most about are those at the top of the social scale, and so I'll begin by looking at the Earls of Sutherland. These men were, after all, those who wielded power over the men who held or worked land in the earldom in a hierarchy that was nonetheless based upon reciprocal activity. The Earl demanded loyalty, recognition of his authority, financial privileges, and the right to call up and lead his tenants in war. In return, the Earl provided protection to his people, both in a physical capacity, but also in terms of legal and other forms of support. The actions of the Earls, therefore, were only in part based upon personal self-interest. There was also a healthy dose of collective interest in forming their decisions. And this may in part explain the apparent alignment of Earl William II of Sutherland in submitting to and supporting the English regime during the war's early years. He appears amongst those notable Scots who attended Edward I's Scottish Parliament in May to August 1296 and submitted to the English king there. Edward I wrote to the Earl in 1297 regarding matters in Scotland, and Sutherland does not appear to have joined the northern rebellion of his neighbour to the south, Andrew Murray of Ork and Petty, in the same year, that combined with the forces of William Wallace and won a victory at Stirling Bridge. Indeed, a letter of 1298-9 from Alexander Comyn noted to Edward I that the Earl of Sutherland was, quote, loyal to the king. Earl William would not be alone in taking this stance. Scotland's earls had most to lose if caught on the wrong side of any such rebellion. Certainly, Earl William remained well thought of by the English crown, and a letter of April 1304 recorded that King Edward I thanks you greatly for the good faith and the good will which you have still borne towards us. Of course, the context of the Wars of Independence changed a number of times, and the landscape shifted dramatically around men like Earl William. They were forced to try to navigate their way through an unstable situation while retaining their lands and preserving their rights for their successors. It was at times a nigh on impossible task, but the Earl of Sutherland saw out the remainder of his life successfully. However, the landscape was changing dramatically yet again when Earl William II died. Earl William III succeeded his father, but was still a minor at the time of his father's death. As a result, the English government awarded control of the young Earl to one of the sons of the Earl of Ross, although Ross himself may have been petitioning the king to ensure that the wardship was taken into his own hands soon after. This was, though, the period of Robert Bruce's rebellion, which failed in 1306, but whose return in 1307, coupled with the death of Edward I of England, changed the political landscape of Scotland and the nature of the Wars of Independence. What before had been a conflict in which men chose either the relative safety and security of peace with England, or to chance it all in defence of the Scottish kingdom and the kingship of King John, changed post-1306 into a civil war. The supporters of Bruce fought with the supporters of Balliol in at times vicious conflict. Bruce also fought the English, who were allied to the Balliol party because they both opposed Bruce's kingship. Although Earl William II had actually been a supporter of the Bruce claim to the throne during the Great Cause, the intervening years may have altered his stance and convinced him that peace with England was the safest route to follow. This may also have been taken on by his son, although the political position of Earl William III was also likely influenced by that of the Earl of Ross and his family, who held the young Sutherland Earl in wardship. The events of the Scottish Civil War resulted in Bruce forces heading north to defeat the families of Comyn and MacDougall, the most prominent leaders of the pro-Balliol anti-Bruce cause. The Earl of Ross was forced to face Bruce alone, as other anti-Bruce figures were unable or unwilling to come to his aid. As a result, Ross agreed a truce with Robert I and refused to take any part in the ongoing conflict while that truce remained. This was, of course, part of Bruce's plan to divide and conquer his Scottish enemies, and it was incredibly effective. The successful operations of 1307-8 in the north meant that the Comyns and MacDougals were defeated outright, and the Earl of Ross submitted to Bruce in October 1308. And it is likely that the Earl of Sutherland did so also, although he may have been calling his own shots by this stage. He was certainly recognised as Earl of Sutherland in his own right, and attended Robert I's first Scottish Parliament in 1309. Thereafter, there is relatively little mention of the Earl in the accounts of the period. This may suggest that he was not a wholehearted supporter of Bruce's kingship. An apparent lack of involvement in the major events of the day could be partially related to location, or indeed because of issues closer to home. The Earls of Sutherland had ongoing issues with feuding in their regions, and keeping the peace amongst various families was an ongoing task in itself. Still, lukewarm support for the Bruce cause from Earl William III may also align with the sole other mention of him in this period, namely the attachment of his seal to the famous Declaration of Arbroath in 1320. This has often been taken historically as a sign of his commitment to the Bruce kingship, but Michael Penman has argued that the Scottish government utilised quite extreme methods in an effort to collect as many seals as possible to append to what was, at the end of the day, a very carefully produced piece of royal propaganda. The seizure of seals in turn, Penman argues, caused great disquiet within Scotland's noble class, and he sees in this activity one potential reason for the major rebellion that was launched and ultimately defeated in the same year that the Declaration of itself was written. There is no suggestion that the Earl of Sutherland was involved in any way with this rebellion, known as the Sewells Conspiracy, but there remain questions over the extent of support for an alternative Balliol ruler at this time. Considering that Earl William of Sutherland does not appear to have benefited particularly from Bruce's kingship, there are few, if any, recorded awards of land, titles, financial gifts, or indeed any signs of kingly political favour towards him. It can be questioned whether he might have felt himself hard done to by Robert I. This is, of course, all speculative, but it is worth just reinforcing the reality that Robert Bruce's kingship was not welcomed wholeheartedly by all. And we should not rush to assume that those historical figures we know less about were obviously or logically supporters of the king. During the period of the Second War, the Earls of Sutherland appear more impressively to the fore than perhaps their predecessors. In spite of their geographical remoteness from the majority of wartime action, they are represented in several engagements from the period. Earl Kenneth does not appear to have been present at the Caithness Moor near Perth too. More curious, considering that the leader of the Bruce army at Dublin was Donald, Earl of Mar, to whom Earl Kenneth was related through marriage to Mar's aunt. Mar's army was also in reality a representation of the collected forces of Scotland north of the Firth of Forth, as a second southern army was in the field at the same time. Whatever the reason for his absence, Earl Kenneth's escape of the slaughter at Dublin turned out to be a short-lived one. For he was part of the large army that was summoned by the new Scottish Guardian, Archibald Douglas, for the invasion of England in 1333, that was intended to relieve Edward III's siege of Berwick-upon-Tweed. The failure of this effort resulted in Douglas marching his army to Halidon Hill, near Berwick, to battle the English king. Less than 12 months after Dublin Moor, Bruce Scottish forces succumbed to another resounding defeat. Forced to abandon a defensive position and to march through boggy terrain before ascending Halidon Hill itself, all the while under English archery fire, the Bruce Scots did well to come to terms with the English forces at all. Earl Kenneth of Sutherland fought in the 3rd Scottish Division, alongside his neighbour, Earl Hugh of Ross, who appears to have wielded command. According to the 15th century chronicler Walter Bower, this division, quote, bravely thrust from one side into the troop led by Edward Balliol, but there was no way in which he could break it up, as it was intent on pressing forward. With no delay, the troops on both sides rushed to and fro, and joining in battle, they wore themselves out in a tremendous fight. But the Scots were out of breath because of the ascent, and after immense bloodshed were forced to retreat. And so there was pitiful slaughter, astonishing flight, and the capture of Scots on an indescribable scale. Earl Kenneth himself was recorded amongst the Scottish noble dead in the aftermath of the battle, killed either during the fight itself or in the flight described by Bower following the confrontation. Earl Kenneth's son, Earl William IV, succeeded to the earldom in 1332 and continued his father's support for the Bruce cause. Indeed, his military career during the Second War of Independence appears to be one of quite considerable activity. It was in 1336 that Earl William of Sutherland is listed amongst the Bruce leaders at the siege of Cooper Castle in Fife. This was not, however, the most auspicious of military endeavours. John Stirling, the Anglo-Scottish keeper of Edinburgh Castle, took 120 men of his garrison by boat across the Firth of Forth, and they, quote, set fire one morning to a couple of villages near Cooper and suddenly attacked those who were besieging it. Thinking that this was the precursor to a much larger English relieving army, the Bruce Scots, quote, seeing the neighbouring villages in flames, a body of men charging fiercely upon them, and those in the castle making a sortie, they took to instant flight, abandoning their siege engines, arms, stores, and all that they had. Sir John Stirling hotly pursued them with his party, reinforced by those in the castle, killing those whom he could catch and driving the others away. Afterwards he returned, seized their baggage, and burnt their engines, and after this successful exploit he marched back to Edinburgh. This unsuccessful military experience does not, however, necessarily appear to have dissuaded Earl William from further effort, although he does appear to have been absent from some of the other major confrontations of the intervening period, such as the Battle of Culblane in 1336 and the Siege of Perth in 1339. His next appearance is around 1340, when he's noted alongside Patrick, Earl of March, leading a Bruce raid into northern England. Earl William was a long way from home, but was very obviously performing the military activities of a notable Scottish lord. Indeed, an English letter to Edward III provides detail of this raid.
He got it professionally done. It was, I think it had been taken over by his secretary. I don't know who's got a secretary.
Sorry, somebody's got their mic on. I'll carry on. The quote then is that Earl Patrick and the Earl of Sutherland entered England on the 28th of June and pillaged the land up to 2 leagues from Bamborough, taking a good 2,000 fat beasts and many prisoners. When they had taken their booty and burned the land, they went towards Dunbar. And a good 4 leagues within Scotland, the English garrison of Roxburgh encountered them and dismounted and fought with them, with the result that they were discomfited and more than half of their people taken and killed. All the prisoners and beasts that they had taken in England were rescued, and the 2 earls escaped with great difficulty. The fight was fierce, and no man of the country was there except Sir Thomas Grey and Sir Robert Manners, who arrived before the earls were utterly discomfited, and the garrison of Roxburgh and the men of the same who were staying in Wark Castle in the company of John Coupland. Earl William's unfortunate military career continued when he next responded to a royal summons to the huge Scottish army that was assembled to invade England in the autumn of 1346. The Scottish army invaded Cumberland, was bought off by rural communities to be left in peace, and moved east and south through Northumberland and into County Durham. It was just outside Durham itself, at the Bishop's Manor of Bear Park, that the Scottish army camped for the night, but it was disturbed on the following morning with the arrival of a hastily arrayed levy of northern Englishmen. The fight which ensued, known as the Battle of Nevilles Cross, was yet another example of Scottish forces facing the English in pitched battle and losing resoundingly. King David II and others of his nobles are recorded putting up tremendous personal resistance during the battle, and it may be presumed that Earl William behaved similarly. But like his king, the Northern Lord was captured during the battle or in its immediate aftermath. His military career largely ended with this defeat, although he does appear to have been part of negotiations for the king's release in 1351, suggesting that he had negotiated his own ransom before this point, although it is alternatively suggested that he may have escaped from imprisonment. This period of freedom was also relatively short-lived, however, as Earl William returned to English captivity in 1357, this time as a hostage for David II as part of the terms of the Treaty of Berwick. And there he remained until 1370. He was joined in English captivity by his son, John, also as a hostage, but the latter died of the plague whilst in confinement. Earl William did not long survive his release, and his story, as well as his career, appears somewhat tragic, considering his lost son, his lost years, and his repeated experience of military defeat. The history of the earldom in this period, of course, was not just about the earls, but also about its people. Unfortunately, such people are phenomenally difficult to trace in the surviving evidence. Still, comparative evidence can be brought in to discover some elements of the impact that war may or may not have had on the people of Sutherland. Firstly, it's worth emphasising that war very rarely intruded directly into this part of Scotland. Indeed, the only military action of note that is recorded is the capture of Skelbo Castle in 1308 by William Wiseman. This is part of the campaign that Robert Bruce launched against his northern Scottish enemies in the winter months of 1307 to 8. But it is unlikely that Bruce was at Skelbo in person. Indeed, the specific association of Wiseman with this episode suggests that it was he who took the castle. Still, this episode is not without some confusion, considering that around this time the Earl of Ross had made a truce with Robert I to keep his own earldom free of the type of destruction recently meted out by Bruce in Buchan. Wiseman's activities in seizing Skelbo, a castle belonging to the Earl of Sutherland, who was still around this time a ward of the Earl of Ross, is curious. Wiseman may have been allowed passage through Ross under the truce, but this seems unlikely, and considering its location on Loch Fleet, it seems far more likely that Wiseman, who would later be created Sheriff of Elgin, took ship in Murray and sailed to Skelbo. Perhaps it was an attempt to put pressure on the young noble, who would soon be making his own decisions, to break from the Earl of Ross and to force his hand in aligning with Bruce and his growing band of allies. If so, it may have worked, as Earl William III appeared in March 1309 as a titled earl in his own right at the St Andrews Parliament. The Skelbo episode should probably also not just be seen as an attack on and a capture of the castle itself. Throughout Bruce's northern campaigns, fire and destruction had been the weapon of choice of the would-be king and his forces as they took the war to their Scottish enemies. Castles were slighted to deny their use by Bruce's enemies, and town and countryside were put to the flame. Inverness, Nairn, and Elgin were all affected by wartime destruction in these campaigns, and the infamous Hership of Buchan was said by the writer John Barber to have been lamented by local people fully 50 years after its occurrence due to the scale and intensity of the destruction meted out in the region. It would be naive to assume then a different approach in this example, and just because the events themselves are not recorded in surviving evidence beyond the brief reference to Skelbo, it does not mean that there was not similar destruction in this region as a result of this incursion. Although based on little evidence, there are further suggestions that can be made about potential military action in Sutherland around this time. Michael Penman has argued recently that the first phase of Robert Bruce's campaigns in 1307 to 8 were part of a two-pronged attack against some of his West Coast enemies. So, for example, the MacDougals of Lorne were pressured at the eastern edge of their territories by Robert Bruce's forces as they pushed north. At the same time, though, this was exacerbated by further pressure put on the MacDougals from their western frontier, as families allied to Bruce, such as the MacDonalds and the MacRories, attacked the MacDougals from the west. This proposed pincer movement emphasises Bruce's ability to bring pressure to bear against his enemies in different forms and in different regions. It also emphasises the close working relationships he was able to develop with some of Scotland's northern families, and to take advantage of historical and local enmities to ensure his own interests. While there is little evidence for any such alliances in the Sutherland region, it remains possible that Bruce could have used similar tactics to those employed against the MacDougals in his efforts in the far north. Alliance with the Mackayes and or the MacLeods and Mackenzies may have been utilised against the Earls of Sutherland and Ross. The Book of Mackay certainly alludes to links between the Strathnaver and Argyll branches of the family, and it's the latter who came under the umbrella of the growing MacDonald hegemony on the west coast during this period. If any of these links tie the Mackays of Sutherland to Robert Bruce, then it remains possible that the military pressure exhibited in the Skelbo incursion was part of a broader effort, potentially including local kin-based support, to ensure the submission of the young Earl of Sutherland to the king. The Earls of Ross may also provide some useful comparison for Sutherland in relation to the military capacity of these earldoms and the impact that military service had on the people of the region. Again, in relation to 1307 to 8, the Earl of Ross wrote to King Edward II of England to defend his recent conduct in taking a truce with Robert I when he had appeared in the north. According to Ross, he heard of Bruce's coming with a great force and called out his men and remained a fortnight on the borders of his earldom with 3,000 men at his own expense and on the borders of two other earldoms, Sutherland and Caithness. Bruce would have destroyed them utterly had not the Earl taken the truce from him until the 2nd of June 1308. We must be careful, of course, with medieval sources and references to numbers. Just because the Earl of Ross indicated that he had 3,000 men in service does not necessarily mean that it was so. Indeed, considering the context of the letter at hand and the effort he appears to have made to convince the English king that he remained a loyal servant, it makes sense that Ross may have inflated the numbers of men with whom he defended these lands. Still, such evidence does at least point towards the military potential of the earldom of Ross, as well as the earldoms of Sutherland and Caithness, if we are indeed to believe that each of these summoned its own forces to protect the land from attack. Although Ross was much the bigger earldom, we can perhaps hazard a guess at the military capacity of the earldom of Sutherland to deal with an emergency in comparison to the Ross example. And historical evidence shows that summonses of local men to deal with invasion and the possibility of attack would likely bring out greater numbers than would be the case if those men were expected to go and fight elsewhere. And we shall return to the latter shortly. But the passing comment of the Earl of Ross in regards to Sutherland in 1308 does suggest that the earldom was reacting to a military threat through the system of military muster that was replicated across the entirety of medieval Scotland. In such circumstances, all men between the ages of 16 and 60 were eligible for military service. A certain number, representative of land-based units at a local level, would then be required to muster at predetermined places, armed and with supplies to feed themselves. At these weapon showings or wappenshaws, there might be the chance to do some basic training, to receive some element of uniform and to reject those insufficiently prepared for the task at hand. What the system produced then was a force of armed men representative of the region, but not necessarily a force of men who were the best prepared, best skilled, or indeed best armed to mount that defence that they were meant to provide. Still, these were forces arrayed in times of need, and the presence of Robert Bruce and his forces in the north does indeed appear to have been just such a moment. And the men of Sutherland appear to have done their duty in this regard, although the period of 2 weeks' service does not seem too onerous. We need to remember, of course, that Ross's letter was written in late 1307, early 1308, and so these men were providing military service during the winter months. Not the most pleasant time to be required to provide military service. But then that was part of the tactics of Robert I. fight when your enemy did not want to, when they least expected to have to, and when the support of tenants to provide that service may be greatly tested. The system of military recruitment alluded to here would also have been the same utilised for more offensive operations, such as the Earl of Sutherland's activities in the 1340s, leading up to and including the Nevilles Cross campaign. As already indicated, men would be required to assemble at local muster points, armed and ready for the campaign ahead. But they would then be required to march to larger scale regional muster points, and then to a national muster point, at which stage the entire army was assembled. So, for the Nevilles Cross campaign, we may presume that the Sutherland muster took place at a recognisable administrative centre, such as Dornoch. These men chosen for service would then proceed to a further muster of forces from the north of the Forth at Perth. Here there was a further weapon showing, and forces may have been thinned somewhat as some men were sent home for not being suitably armed, trained or supplied. This larger force then proceeded to the general muster at Peebles before the army marched south and west and crossed the English frontier before laying siege to the border fortress of Liddell. The logistics of all of this, the time it would have taken, and the sheer effort of walking, or perhaps riding, from the far north of Scotland, even before they got to England, is rather impressive. Using modern software and a very basic suggestion of route, the march from Dornoch to Durham would have been around at least 350 miles. And that does not account for the return journey, when the Scottish forces who did escape were fleeing for their lives in the aftermath of the defeat at Nevilles Cross. Indeed, this example provides a useful case study, even with relatively little evidence, of the impressive nature of Highland military service in this period. The Nevilles Cross campaign took place in October, but considering the distances involved, the preparations and musters for such would have begun some time earlier. This had the potential to upset the agricultural calendar and have a very real effect on people in the earldom as their men had to pick up and leave for military service. Such an impact was made inordinately worse by the loss in battle and the casualties that invariably ensued. Battle itself and the flight afterwards, with mounted English knights chasing after and riding down fleeing Scots, accounted for many deaths. And while we have no account of the physical suffering of the Sutherland contingent, we may assume that it was substantial. The capture of the Earl suggests his involvement in the thick of the action, and his men were likely right there with him. A description of another battle, that fought at Dublin Moor, noted how the Earl of Fife, quote, was captured, and with him various nobles and brave men, after 360 men in armour had first been killed under his standard. An Earl's retinue was intended to protect his lord in the thick of the action, and so it is not out with the realms of possibility that the Earl of Sutherland's men performed a similar duty at Nevilles Cross. Still, knightly warriors could at least expect some possibility of surrender. Knights were, after all, part of the chivalric world, and were valuable prisoners for the ransoms that could be expected from them to purchase their release. Those further down the social scale, escape from the battlefield would have been rather more difficult. Surrender was not really an option for such men, as they were not worth anything as prisoners. Therefore, foot soldiers are often described being slain as they tried to flee, past Scottish defeats being described in terms of Scots running for the border and indeed being pursued over it. Those Sutherland men in service of their lord would likely have struggled to escape. Those that did had a long journey ahead of them to return home. Some were likely injured, and some may have struggled in the long term with disabilities caused by military action. And back home, the loss of life would have had various implications for urban and rural communities, as men were lost from the workforce and families with holdings were affected in the longer term by the loss of a husband or a son. Lands may have changed hands as a result, and families may have found themselves in difficult straits without these individuals there to assist in the day-to-day operation of family and working life. And beyond these considerations, there were indeed other elements too that would have affected local community life and the people of this region. At various times, the Scots across the kingdom were required to contribute to the war effort through taxation. Such may have been limited, as medieval Scotland was a kingdom that largely rejected regular calls to tax its populace, but the demands of wartime and the need to recreate the machinery of government and state did require some contribution from the people. Moreover, many Scots were also required to help pay for peace. In 1328, as part of the agreement spelled out in the treaties of Edinburgh and Northampton, Scotland volunteered to pay reparations for the damage and destruction done to Northern England over the previous years. In 1357 too, the Scots undertook to pay a huge ransom to ensure the release of their king, David II, from English imprisonment following Nevilles Cross. This ransom was raised in part through taxation of the Scottish population. These then were the indirect but still very real consequences of war that affected the Scottish people at large, including those in Sutherland. Other elements, though not war-related, also made themselves felt during this period of ongoing conflict. In the 1310s, climate change resulted in increasingly cold winters and wet summers. As a result, crops did not grow, and Europe as a whole was subject to severe famine. Scotland suffered as much as many other kingdoms at this time, although the Scots continued their war efforts during these years. The effects of famine were, though, likely overwhelming, in particular in areas of more marginal agricultural land. This natural disaster was followed up in the 1340s, again during a period of conflict in the aftermath of Nevilles Cross, with the arrival of the Black Death in Scotland in 1347. Quite possibly brought to Scotland by returning Scottish raiders into already infected England, the Black Death spread across the whole kingdom. The plague brought human loss on an unimaginable scale, and we must imagine that Sutherland was affected also. However, as with many of the elements discussed here, we cannot ever really know the direct impact of war and other factors on the people and families of this region. Medieval records and evidence are insufficiently available or detailed to provide such specific detail. But we can, I think, presume that the deaths of Sutherland men on campaign, during sieges, in battle, and in its aftermath, coupled with the demands for money, food, and other elements as part of wartime logistics, or to help pay for peacetime, would have had a very real and a very telling impact on the communities of this region. And I think it is worth recognising that simple fact, even if the evidence is not there for us to delve any deeper into its reality. To conclude then, I've endeavoured today to put together something of a consideration of Sutherland's involvement in and contribution to the Scottish Wars of Independence. Such a study is not easy for the reasons already provided, but sufficient evidence does exist about specific events and their context to allow us to explore in a little depth the possibilities and likelihoods of this period. The Scottish Wars of Independence, as Barron made clear at the start, were indeed a national effort. While they were increasingly fought in the border regions, the various periods of active conflict fought across much of the kingdom and involving men and women from across the entirety of Scotland emphasised the broader nature of the war. And while the actual goings-on in Sutherland during this period are often absent in the historical record, and we have little or no idea of what was actually happening on the ground, we can at least recapture the involvement of Sutherland people where evidence allows us to take some information and build it into that wider and better known context of events. It's interesting, from my perspective at least, to see an apparent change in the attitude of the Earls of Sutherland over time. Earls William II and William III do indeed appear to have been lukewarm in their patriotic sentiments. As already indicated, they may well have considered peace and security under English rule to be a better possibility than the violence and disorder that followed as periods of rebellion time and again prompted English retaliation. Moreover, the apparently unenthusiastic support of Robert Bruce, if not actual opposition, suggests that the status quo was something that the Earls of Sutherland sought more than anything else in order to preserve their own and their people's lands and livelihoods. What is interesting then is that the family's view on things appears to have changed come the 1330s. The death of Earl William III in around 1330 and the succession of Earl Kenneth and then Earl William IV shows a very different outlook, one in which the Earls of Sutherland committed themselves to support the son of Robert I in his war against Edward Balliol and Edward III. The active participation of both men in two of the three major battles of the Second War demonstrates, to me at least, a more enthusiastic support of the Bruce regime and a greater personal involvement in the politics of Scotland more generally. And ultimately, they were rewarded for it. Earl William IV was granted the hand of Margaret Bruce, David II's sister, in marriage. Entry into the extended royal family was a signal of particular favour, and grants of land followed. The birth of a son to the couple encouraged more royal largesse, as David II saw in the Sutherland heir a potential successor to the throne, if he died childless, and a means to thwart the ambitions of his nephew, Robert the Steward, son of his half-sister. The earldom of Sutherland itself was created into a regality for the earl, giving him almost total control of his territory and investing him with king-like powers over his possessions. This lasted, however, only for as long as his son remained alive, and John's death in Lincoln in 1361 ended that. Countess Margaret had died in 1346, and the combined events meant that Earl William's moment in the sun was almost over. But the Sutherlands are an interesting example of a family that nearly made it into the big time, and this was arguably as a result of the Earl and his tenants providing loyal military service during the Second War of Independence. war for some was a time of opportunity. Ultimately, for Earl William, he did not quite make good on his effort. But the involvement of the Earls of Sutherland and their tenants in the history of the Scottish Wars of Independence is undeniable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. MacInnes. Hopefully you can all hear me. I think we'll honour this in the usual way. Excellent. Thanks. And I hope you can hear me now. Thank you, Iain. That was a really excellent talk, which opens up geographical, chronological perspectives on the Wars of Independence. Now, I'm really keen for those who wish to ask questions of Dr. MacInnes. And just for those of you that aren't familiar with the software, the way to do that is really simply to unmute your mic, which is the bottom left, and switch that to black from red. So if anybody would like to come in, perhaps I'll open this up to non-UHI people first. So if you're from outside the University of the Highlands and Islands, and you would like to ask a question of Dr. MacInnes, I'd invite you to come in now. There may be a slight delay, but we'll see what we can do. So if you would like somebody from outside UHI to ask a question, please unmute your mic now and please go ahead and ask.
It's Andy King. I'm just wondering, Iain, do you have any idea why the Earls of Sutherland decided to support David Bruce in the 1330s rather than Balliol? What prompted their sort of harder sort of allegiance to the Bruce cause?
Cheers, Andy. Good to see you. Yeah, I suppose it's something I need to give more thought to. I think. I think my natural assumption is that there are those in the second phase who are Balliol supporters. There are those who are Bruce supporters, but they're kind of the minority, and the majority are very much just sitting on the fence and waiting to see which way the wind blows. And it's perhaps that the Sutherlands weren't necessarily pro-Balliol as more they were anti-Bruce in the period before. So that the change is not perhaps as big as it may look. It may just be that come the 1330s, it doesn't necessarily look as if Balliol's a winner. Although, of course, the events of the early 1330s would suggest otherwise. But Kenneth of Sutherland's activities early on, I mean, as I said, it's slightly odd that he's not at Dublin, although I wonder if his age comes into it. But the fact he is there at Halidon alongside Hugh of Ross, his neighbour, both of whom are killed at it, it seems that northern contingent, at least at that time, is pro-Bruce enough that they're there and doing their bit. And the fact that William then continues that, I think it's just that they may not have been quite as part of the kind of polarised element as they might otherwise have been, and that's the way they choose to go at that point. And they stick with it, but that's all very speculative.
Excellent, thank you. Any other questions from outside UHI for Dr. MacInnes? Okay, we'll maybe open it up more generally. Anyone else out there who would like to ask a question or pick up on any of the points raised in the talk? Just a reminder, if you do wish to speak, to unmute your mic, you need to turn the button on the left at the bottom to black from red. And that way you should be able to come in and say what you wish.
Hello, it's David here. Yes, thank you very much for a very interesting talk, Iain, and it's so interesting to have the spotlight turned in this particular direction. And I was very struck by the comments towards the end about the whole impact of military service and the huge distances they have to travel. I was wanting to just pick up on the previous discussion though, which is, I mean, were the Earls of Ross related to the Bruces as well through? But I'm afraid I can't remember the detail, but it's in. I'm thinking of that bit in Area 2 where it's got the royal genealogy and it's all they appear in the Bruce section, if you want to put it that way, which kind of, if true, given the Bruces, they've got the marriage alliances with the Earls of Mar as well, and then you've spoken about the later one with the Earls of Sutherland. I mean, it does feel this question of why might they be inclined towards the Bruces. Is there this family dynamic here that we know about the huge network that the Commons created through marriages? Was there also a sort of Bruce one that was quite well established or became established in this period?
Good. Yeah, no, I think again that's something I need to get into in a lot more detail. I think just for this paper, I was determined to focus very much on the individuals, I suppose. But yes, the next thing I need to do is absolutely get into those links between these families and indeed between the opposing families at the top. I mean, I think the thing with the Rosses is that in my period, obviously you get that shift of William of Ross, who it's not because he's a Balliol supporter, he just doesn't get on with David II, and so you have that situation where Ross is then allied to Stuart, and so it's a different dynamic that's going on, but there are these personal enmities that come into play as well. So slightly fluffy response, sorry, but no, I absolutely do need to get into the nitty gritty of it. I think there's a lot of ground to made up of that regional interest as well. What are the links between the Sutherlands and the Rosses and indeed the Caithness? How much is there a block in the north, if we can talk about it that way? Because Ross obviously sees himself as kind of in charge of the north, I think, even in this period. And obviously it's a whacking great earldom he's got, so that may well be based on some sort of reality. But then that begs the question: how does that relate to the Randolphs, who are obviously the next ones to the south? And it's that whole northern political dynamic, the landholding element, the links between these families in terms of marriage, I think all of that needs to really be picked apart a bit more to try and get to more of an understanding of what's going on and what's perhaps driving their decision making. Because yes, my stuff here is not sufficiently based on enough of that investigation, but I think that's definitely the way to take this further.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Any other questions out there before I fire in with mine?
Can I ask one, David? It's Marjorie.
Yes.
Hi, Ian. Thanks very much. I guess my question follows on. It's a geographical one. What struck me was looking at the map. The potential for interaction and across the Murray Firth. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on what sort of influences were being exercised from the southern shore of the Murray Firth.
Thank you, Margaret. Absolutely. I think yes, we ignore that connection to our Pearl, and obviously David knows more about this in terms of that maritime connection than I do. But yes, absolutely. I think what's going on in the northeast must also potentially then overlap into this part of the world, and I think that's. That very interesting, just little example of Skelbo, which gets the shortest of mentions and nothing else. It's very tantalising in terms of how these campaigns may have expanded, and indeed the natural area of interest that these men who are then put in position by Bruce once these territories have been turned to his control, how they then expand their areas of interest in an effort to control that territory, and indeed what is their territory. I think all of that is we don't often know well enough what sheriffs are involved in. For example, and the example of Wiseman is an interesting one. How much territory did he see as being his to control, or how much remit did he have to expand into neighbouring areas to ensure there is that continued loyalty towards Bruce? So yeah, again, absolutely, Marja. Again, this is, I suppose, it's a little bit introductory in nature, but yes, that's definitely something to explore as well. That link and whether what's going on in the kind of larger Murray area is directly affecting what's happening further north.
I think all I'd add there, Ian, is it's not necessarily a wholly maritime connection, because you have a series of 3 to 4 very short sea crossings to get to Murray from Sutherland across the 3 firths in the way, so it doesn't require huge maritime capabilities to make that communicative leap, so to speak. Any other questions out there for Dr.
David, could I ask a quick question, David?
Please do.
Hello, it's Iain here, the other Iain. In your presentation, Iain, you mentioned Skelbo Castle. I've been to Skelbo a few times, and I'm always struck with it's quite a sad, neglected ruin. We have Duffus Castle on our doorstep here in Elgin, which is in a similar condition. My question is, do you think the north of Scotland as a whole does enough to promote the historic role within the Wars of Independence? Is there scope for some kind of historic trail, perhaps linking places like Skelbo, like Havelock, like Duffus, like Banff? Is there something we could do to promote the Wars of Independence more in this area?
Cheers, Ian. No, that's a really interesting idea. No, I think we absolutely could. I mean, I think I suppose there would be a view that among some that the Wars of Independence are perhaps promoted too much already in Scottish history and Scottish heritage. But no, I like that idea of something kind of trail like, tying these places together and showing, how the war did affect, such a large area. I mean, I suppose it goes back to that point at the start of the war largely being seen as something fought in the south, and something like that would absolutely emphasize the fact that actually it encompasses at various different points, of course, but encompasses quite a lot of action in a lot of areas you wouldn't necessarily expect. I did have an idea a while ago of trying to pitch something to like Historic Scotland and NTS and things, trying to combine my two current areas of interest, which is coming up with like comics to sell in the shop, they're tying in the depicting the events that relate to that particular site. I haven't actually done too much about it. I need to try and explore that a bit more. But no, I agree. Yeah, I think that would be something of interest. And I suppose things like Visit Scotland and things are very much looking at for new ideas because of the current situation. How do you market Scotland in a post-COVID world? So yeah, maybe there is room for that.
Thank you.
I was just thinking about your Dornoch to Durham march. I mean, it seems vast, particularly in the period of lockdown. In a way, it's hard for us to imagine such a long journey. How does that compare with other marches of the period? Is it outstanding in its length and complexity?
I suppose possibly not, just because we know of the involvement of others. I mean, although they don't get as far because of events. So you have the McRory family turning out for the same campaign. They only get as far as the Perth muster because their clan chief is assassinated by the men of the Earl of Ross while they're there. It's that internal Scottish fighting continues even in circumstances like that, and so they all take off back north once McCreary's dead. But they would have done the same, and I suppose considering where the McCrearys are coming from, that's a fair whack as well. And I think these types of campaigns, those ones that do descend into Northern England, I mean, it mostly is just the large scale invasions. It's not necessarily those raids that Bruce and his commanders launched in the 1310s and 1320s. It's big scale stuff, and I suppose there are less of them. So Nevilles Cross does provide a rather useful example of the Scottish kingdom at war, and indeed on that offensive war rather than a defensive one. So yes, perhaps more exceptional than that, but not wholly. And I think it was just worth, it was when I plotted it on the map, and you can look at it and think, dear God, that is a fair distance. And then the realization, of course, of the distance to get back again in the aftermath of the defeat, which is even worse to consider. So yeah, I think it's just as always when you turn to maps and things, it's just realizing the reality of things. It's very easy to read about a list of place names and not actually get a proper feel for what that was actually like. Whereas when you start to actually plot it on a map and think about the distances involved and the context of it all, it does, I think, in my experience anyway, it does bring a bit more reality to it.
Yeah, it was really powerful the way you presented it on the map. Really, really interesting. Okay, there's a lot of people out there, so I want to give people another chance, a couple more minutes, possible options. If you would like to ask a question, please do go ahead and unmute your mic and get your word in now.
Hi, Ian. Just a question here, just Ethan. Just you touched briefly on Caithness during the period, and we obviously have a lot more material on the relationship between Sutherland and Ross. But in terms of Caithness, do we have any indication of the interplay between the two earldoms? You have the death of Magnus and I think it's Malice, the Earl of Strathern, becoming the Earl of Caithness in this period, and kind of a realignment of Caithness becoming less close to Norway and more integrated into the Kingdom of Scotland. Is there any kind of shift in that period between Sutherland and Caithness's relationship?
Cheers, Ethan. Good to see you. Yeah, I mean, I think Caithness is an interesting example. Although in the second one, I suppose that link, or the fact that it falls into the orbit of Malice of Strathern, is an interesting one, just because of Malice's own career, which is deeply problematic. He effectively, grants away his earldom to the disinherited, or is forced to. I mean, give him maybe a little bit of credit. But yeah, David II obviously doesn't think much of it, because he takes Strathern off him as soon as he comes back, and he's left only with Caithness. So yeah, I suppose I think it's likely to be the situation where it's an absentee earl, and then it's an absentee earl who's also a problematic figure within the political machinations of the time. So I suppose the assumption is, for the second phase anyway, that Caithness is largely on its own, and then you have to assume under the potential, or within the orbit then, of someone like the Earl of Ross, who is doing the crown a favour by looking after it, but extending his own interest at the same time. Yes, absolutely. I think, again, getting more into the nitty gritty of what's potentially going on, where that's possible, I think would raise a few interesting points to build up in regards to this kind of stuff.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions out there? There's somebody just trying to come in just there. Would you maybe like to try again? Well, okay, I think we'll leave it there perhaps, Iain. Thank you very much for getting our history talk series off to such a cracking start. Really great talk, and thank you to everybody who attended also. Really appreciate everybody coming in. And we will have further talks coming up in future weeks, so keep your eyes open for that, keep your eyes peeled. A lot of talks coming up, and great to hear your comments, and we hope to get a recording of this up. Apologies for the technical problems at my end. I've no idea what happened at the start there, but Iain performed very well, much better than me on this occasion. So thank you very much to Iain and to all of you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much.
Thanks all.